Long before mammals ruled the world, most of them lived quietly at its edges. 100 million years ago, evolution was already dividing them into many forms, testing different ways of living in a world that offered no guarantees. Dinosaurs filled the open spaces of the land, but they were not alone. Mammals shared the planet with them, not as a single type, but as many different lineages, each following its own uncertain path. The fossil record shows a quiet diversity already unfolding. Mammals experimenting with different teeth, different diets, different ways of moving through the world. Some climbed, some burrowed, some moved through trees, others hunted, scavenged, or specialized in narrow ecological roles. This was not a waiting period, it was a time of branching. Evolution was already selecting, narrowing, and discarding possibilities long before the age of dinosaurs came to an end. And when that world finally changed, survival did not simply favor mammals as a group, it favored only a few. Most of those early mammal lineages still disappeared. Their paths ended quietly, leaving behind only fragments in stone and unanswered questions about what might have been. The fossil record does not tell a story of steady progress. It reveals a long pattern of experimentation, followed by loss. So, what determined which mammals endured and which ones faded away? Why did so many evolutionary paths close, even after the dinosaurs were gone? And what does their absence tell us about how uncertain survival has always been? Tonight, we drift into the forgotten history of the mammals you were never taught about, the branches that once existed, and the many that did not continue. Before we begin, if this space helps you unwind, a like or a subscribe helps others find their way here too. And I'd love to know where you're winding down from tonight and what time it is there. It's always comforting to see how far this little corner of science travels. Now take a slow breath. Let your shoulders soften, and together let us step softly into the forgotten age when mammals lived alongside dinosaurs. The age scientists call the Mesozoic unfolds across an immense stretch of time, a long middle chapter of Earth's story, shaped by slow change rather than sudden revolution. It begins after the devastation of the Permian extinction, when life cautiously rebuilt itself, and ends only when the world was reshaped again by catastrophe. Within this expanse lie three chapters: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous, each with its own climates, continents, and communities of living things. Together, they form a world that feels distant yet foundational, a bridge between ancient chaos and the landscapes that would eventually feel familiar. Mammals were present throughout this entire era, not appearing at the edges, but woven quietly into its fabric from early on. During the Triassic, small warm-bodied creatures already moved through leaf litter and shadows, sharing the land with the ancestors of dinosaurs. As the Jurassic unfolded and giant reptiles rose into dominance, mammals did not vanish or pause their evolution. They adapted, diversified, and persisted. By the time the Cretaceous arrived, mammals had already spent tens of millions of years refining their lifestyles, spreading across continents, and carving out roles that allowed them to endure beneath towering forms. When scientists speak of Mesozoic mammals, they are careful with language because not every furred or shrew-like creature from this time fits the definition in the same way. Some early forms were close relatives rather than true members of the mammal family, holding a mixture of old and emerging traits. Their jaws and teeth hint at mammalian futures, while other parts of their anatomy still reflect deep reptilian ancestry. True mammals appear once key features come together: precise tooth patterns, a restructured jaw, and the beginnings of the defining traits that would later feel unmistakable. This gradual shift makes the boundaries feel soft rather than sharp. There was no single moment when mammals suddenly arrived fully formed. Instead, they emerged through slow layering, each generation carrying small refinements shaped by survival in a world dominated by larger, louder neighbors. The fossil record captures these transitions in fragments, a jawbone here, a tooth there, offering glimpses of lives lived close to the ground and often beyond easy detection. The Mesozoic is often misunderstood because its most dramatic inhabitants command attention. Dinosaurs left vast skeletons that dominate museums and imagination alike, while mammals left subtler traces, their small bodies, delicate bones, and hidden lifestyles rarely fossilized as readily. This imbalance has long painted a simplified picture, one where mammals appear absent or insignificant. In reality, the era was layered and complex, shaped not only by giants but also by quiet persistence, by creatures whose success was measured not in size or spectacle, but in continuity across deep time. Long before dinosaurs became the most visible presence on land, the ancestors of mammals were already shaping a different way of living. These early forms emerged in the shadow of the greatest loss life had ever experienced, the Permian extinction, when nearly everything familiar was erased. In the quiet aftermath, ecosystems rebuilt slowly, and among the survivors were small, adaptable creatures whose bodies carried the blueprint of something new. They did not arrive as dominant figures, but as careful experimenters in a changed world. These early mammal ancestors belonged to a broader lineage often called synapsids, animals that still carried reptile like features while beginning to depart from them. Over generations, their jaws shifted, their teeth differentiated, and their skulls grew more efficient at feeding and sensing their surroundings. These changes were subtle at first, barely noticeable in the fossil record, but they marked a long departure from the old forms that had ruled before the extinction. Survival favored those that could process food more effectively and move with precision through unstable environments. As climate swung between extremes during the Triassic, these animals developed internal strategies that made them resilient. A more controlled metabolism allowed their bodies to generate steady warmth, freeing them from strict dependence on external temperatures. This internal balance meant they could remain active when the air cooled, when the sun dipped below the horizon, or when shelter was scarce. The rise of fur likely followed, not as decoration, but as insulation, a soft barrier against a world that no longer offered consistency. Night became another refuge. While larger reptiles relied on daylight warmth and size, these early mammal ancestors slipped into darkness, guided by sharpened hearing and an increasing reliance on scent. Their eyes and inner ears adapted for low light and quiet movement. This nocturnal rhythm reduced competition and danger, shaping nervous systems attuned to subtle cues rather than sweeping dominance. It was a life of patience, listening, and careful timing rather than confrontation. By the time dinosaurs began their ascent, mammals were already distinct in how they lived, even if they remained modest in size. Their bodies emphasized efficiency over scale, flexibility over force. Reproduction shifted toward nurturing fewer young with greater investment, a strategy suited to unpredictable conditions. These traits did not arise in response to dinosaurs, but existed before them, forged during a period when survival depended on enduring instability rather than controlling the landscape. This early separation of paths meant mammals entered the age of dinosaurs with an identity already formed. They were not waiting to become something else, nor were they incomplete versions of later creatures. They were the product of deep time and quiet refinement, shaped by extinction, darkness, and persistence. When dinosaurs took center stage, mammals were already settled into their role, living close to the ground, carrying forward a lineage defined not by spectacle, but by continuity across ages that rarely stood still. As dinosaurs expanded into towering forms and reshaped the surface of the land, mammals adjusted without fanfare. They did not challenge this dominance directly, nor did they vanish beneath it. Instead, they altered their relationship with the landscape itself. Forest floors, root systems, fallen logs, and shallow burrows became zones of relative safety, places where large bodies struggled to follow. Life for mammals unfolded closer to the ground and closer to cover, guided by caution rather than confrontation. Small size, far from being a limitation, opened doors that scale could not. Compact bodies required less food, allowing mammals to survive on scattered resources that larger animals ignored. They could slip through dense vegetation, squeeze into rock crevices, and shelter beneath debris left behind by storms or seasonal flooding. Their light footprints left few traces, and their movements blended into the background rhythms of the environment. In a world dominated by weight and force, subtlety proved durable. Rather than competing for the same space or food, mammals learned avoidance as a form of success. They adjusted activity patterns to moments when the land felt quieter, when temperatures cooled and predators relied less on sight. This rhythm reduced encounters and conserved energy. Fossil evidence hints at this behavior not through dramatic scenes, but through anatomy shaped for quiet persistence. Enlarged inner ear structures suggest sensitivity to faint sounds, while eye sockets reflect vision tuned for dim conditions rather than bright daylight. The ground itself became an ally. Digging limbs, reinforced shoulders, and compact torsos appear repeatedly in the fossil record, pointing to lives spent in tunnels and temporary shelters. These underground spaces offered protection not only from predators, but from shifting climates and seasonal extremes. Beneath the surface, temperature remained more stable, and survival depended less on speed and more on endurance. Mammals learned to wait rather than flee. Even above ground, they favored edges over open spaces. Riverbanks, forest margins, and dense undergrowth formed corridors where movement stayed concealed. Food sources such as insects, seeds, and fallen fruit were abundant in these zones, supporting diverse diets without drawing attention. Teeth adapted for precise processing rather than raw power, allowing mammals to exploit food overlooked by larger animals. This quiet specialization reduced competition and minimized risk. Over time, this way of living reshaped behavior and biology together. Neural systems favored memory, spatial awareness, and flexible responses to changing conditions. Reproduction aligned with safety and shelter, emphasizing protection over quantity. None of these traits were dramatic on their own, yet together they formed a strategy well suited to a crowded world ruled by giants. Dinosaurs dominated the visible stage, leaving impressions in bone beds and towering fossils. Mammals occupied the spaces between, beneath, and beside them, largely unseen. Their story during this time is written not in overt presence, but in careful choices repeated over countless generations. Living in a world of giants, mammals survived by becoming masters of the margins, shaping a future through restraint, adaptability, and patience rather than force. The emergence of the first true mammals did not arrive with spectacle, but with quiet precision. Over time, a set of traits gathered within certain lineages, aligning into a new way of living that felt distinct even against the backdrop of long familiar forms. These animals remained small and unobtrusive, yet their bodies carried refinements that set them apart. The shift was not sudden, but once complete, it marked a clear departure from their closest relatives, a soft but unmistakable turning point in Earth's living fabric. One of the most visible changes was the spread of fur, a thin living layer that transformed how bodies interacted with the world. Fur trapped warmth close to the skin, smoothing the temperature swings of day and night, season and shelter. It muffled sound, softened outlines, and turned movement into something quieter and less visible. In forests thick with leaf litter and low light, this covering offered subtle advantages, allowing mammals to remain active across longer stretches of time while conserving energy in cooler hours. Milk followed as another quiet innovation, reshaping survival at its most fragile stage. Instead of releasing young to the uncertainties of the environment too soon, mothers carried nourishment with them, converting their own resources into a steady supply of growth. This bond allowed offspring to develop safely within protected spaces, hidden from many dangers. Growth became slower but more reliable, guided by care rather than exposure. In a world where sudden loss was common, this investment created resilience measured across generations. Teeth tell this story perhaps most clearly. Early true mammals developed highly specialized dental patterns, each tooth shaped for a precise task. Sharp cusps sliced insects, ridged surfaces cracked seeds, and flatter molars ground plant matter into digestible forms. This diversity allowed mammals to fine-tune their diets, drawing nutrition from small, scattered sources that larger animals overlooked. Eating no longer depended on raw force, but on efficiency and control, turning limited resources into steady sustenance. Together, these traits formed a system rather than a collection of parts. Warmth supported extended activity, feeding supported careful growth, and teeth supported flexible diets. In a landscape ruled by massive bodies and long strides, mammals succeeded by refining the small. They avoided competition not by withdrawal, but by specialization, fitting themselves into spaces and schedules left open by giants. Their presence rarely altered the surface of the land, yet it quietly reshaped the future. By the time these traits settled into place, mammals were no longer defined by what they lacked, but by how completely their bodies served their lives. They lived beneath the notice of towering forms, yet carried within them a design capable of enduring change. In the steady rhythm of fur, milk, and measured nourishment, the first true mammals established a pattern that would persist long after the world itself shifted again. The image of Mesozoic mammals as uniformly small softens when fossils are considered more closely. Among the scattered bones and compressed skulls are signs of bodies that pushed beyond the margins, mammals that grew heavier, broader, and more assertive in form. These animals did not dominate landscapes, yet their remains suggest a quiet expansion of possibility. Size varied more than once believed, shaped by opportunity rather than ambition, and preserved in fragments that hint at lives lived with greater physical presence. Some lineages reach dimensions comparable to modern badgers or medium-sized dogs, sturdy animals with reinforced limbs and powerful jaws. Their skeletons show muscle attachment points suited for strength, not just speed or concealment. Teeth broadened and thickened, capable of crushing bone and resisting wear. These mammals moved with confidence through leaf litter and undergrowth, not merely surviving, but actively shaping their immediate surroundings through feeding and movement. Evidence also points toward predatory behavior that crossed a boundary long assumed unbroken. Certain mammals develop teeth and jaw mechanics suited for seizing prey rather than simply processing insects or plants. Fossils preserve bite marks and skeletal associations that suggest attacks on small vertebrates, including the young of dinosaurs. These encounters were not widespread hunts across open terrain, but brief, opportunistic moments, likely near nests or along sheltered paths. Within these narrow windows, mammals stepped briefly into the role of hunter rather than hidden observer. Yet, even with increased size and predatory ability, these mammals did not ascend into dominance. Growth brought advantages, but also exposure. Larger bodies demanded more energy, tying survival closely to consistent food sources that fluctuated with climate and season. Visibility increased risk, narrowing the safety provided by concealment. In ecosystems already structured around immense reptiles, pushing size too far reduced flexibility, the very quality that had long sustained mammal lineages. Environmental instability further limited expansion. Shifts in temperature, vegetation, and sea level repeatedly reshaped habitats, favoring animals that could retreat, wait, or subsist on varied diets. Larger mammals faced greater pressure during these transitions, as specialization narrowed their margin for error. When conditions shifted, smaller relatives could adjust quietly, while bigger forms declined and disappeared, leaving only faint traces in the fossil record. These larger mammals reveal an important truth about the Mesozoic world. Possibility existed, but success depended on restraint as much as strength. Mammals experimented with size, behavior, and ecological roles, yet those experiments rarely endured. Dominance was neither their path nor their advantage. Instead, their history during this time reflects careful balance, moments of expansion followed by quiet contraction. Within that rhythm, the mammal story continued, shaped not by conquest, but by knowing when to grow and when to remain small enough to endure. As time settled into long rhythms, mammal diversity quietly widened beneath the familiar outlines of the Mesozoic world. The lineage did not grow as a single thread, but as a branching weave, splitting again and again into forms that shared ancestry, yet lived in strikingly different ways. Fossils reveal a spread of mammal groups far greater than the narrow set that survives today, a layered community whose complexity is only slowly coming into focus. What remains to us is not the full pattern, but scattered traces of a once crowded design. Compared to the present, where a few major branches dominate the living world, the Mesozoic hosted a broader range of mammal families, many with no modern equivalents. Some resembled elongated climbers with grasping limbs suited for life among branches. Others took on compact shapes built for burrowing, their bodies reinforced for pushing through soil rather than running across open ground. There were swimmers adapted for river margins, gliders that crossed gaps between trees, and ground dwellers that moved through dense cover with quiet precision. These forms existed side by side, often separated not by distance, but by habit and timing. Body plans varied in subtle but meaningful ways. Limbs shifted length and angle to suit climbing or digging. Tails thickened for balance or thinned into steering tools. Teeth diversified further, reflecting specialized diets that ranged from insects to seeds to small prey. Each adjustment represented a response to a specific niche, refined across generations that rarely left dramatic impressions in stone. Diversity unfolded not through spectacle, but through quiet differentiation, a steady unfolding of possibilities shaped by local conditions. This abundance is often overlooked because it does not announce itself easily. Many of these mammals were small, their bones delicate and easily lost to time. Fossilization favored larger animals and open environments, leaving forests, burrows, and river edges underrepresented in the record. As a result, the evidence arrives fragmented: jaw fragments without bodies, isolated teeth without context. Reconstructing diversity from such remains requires patience and restraint, allowing patterns to emerge slowly rather than all at once. Another reason this richness fades from memory lies in how history is told. Narratives often compress the Mesozoic into a backdrop for dinosaurs, leaving other lives reduced to footnotes. Mammals become a single supporting presence rather than a constellation of experiments unfolding simultaneously. This framing simplifies a story that was anything but simple. Within this hidden expansion, mammals explored many directions, though few endured beyond the era that shaped them. What remains today is not the full measure of their past, but a surviving sliver, shaped by later chance and shifting worlds. The Mesozoic mammal story is one of abundance without permanence, a reminder that diversity can flourish quietly, even when most of its forms are destined to fade back into the stone that first preserved them. As surface worlds shifted and reshaped themselves, many mammals turned downward, finding stability beneath their feet. Soil and sediment became more than ground to cross. They became shelter, insulation, and refuge. Underground life offered distance from towering bodies and open skies, creating spaces where size mattered less than persistence. Within these darkened corridors, mammals discovered a quieter rhythm, one measured by touch, memory, and the slow movement of Earth. Burrowing reshaped bodies as clearly as it reshaped behavior. Limbs shortened and strengthened, shoulders broadened, and claws curved into tools capable of cutting through compacted soil. Skulls angled forward, allowing force to be applied efficiently while digging, and sensory systems adapted to limited light. Whiskers traced walls, noses followed faint chemical trails, and hearing tuned itself to vibrations moving through the ground. These were not dramatic changes, but steady refinements, repeated until digging became second nature. The fossil record captures these lives in fragments, yet the signs are unmistakable. Hardened limb bones show muscle attachments shaped by repeated excavation. Claws appear worn and reinforced, their edges smoothed by contact with sediment. In rare cases, entire tunnel systems have been preserved, networks winding through ancient soils, revealing chambers widened for resting and narrower passages shaped for movement. These traces speak of planning rather than impulse, of spaces revisited and maintained over time. Underground living offered protection on several fronts. Predators that dominated open ground rarely followed prey into confined spaces where movement slowed and sight failed. Even when danger passed overhead, burrows remained steady, their entrances concealed by vegetation or collapsed debris. Within these chambers, temperature fluctuated less dramatically than at the surface, shielding their inhabitants from heat, cold, and sudden shifts in weather. During droughts, underground humidity lingered. During cold snaps, earth retained warmth. Survival extended through patience rather than speed. Food sources adapted to this life as well. Roots, tubers, insects, and stored plant material supported mammals that spent much of their time below ground. Some burrows opened near feeding grounds, while others connected to multiple exits, offering flexible paths through familiar terrain. Memory guided these movements, turning darkness into a mapped space rather than an unknown one. Over generations, these underground routes became inherited landscapes, shaped and reshaped as conditions changed. Living beneath the surface also allowed mammals to endure cycles of instability that reshaped the wider world. Fires swept across forests, storms flattened canopies, and temperatures shifted beyond predictable bounds. Below, life continued at a different pace. This separation did not mean isolation from the surface, but selective engagement with it, emerging when conditions allowed, retreating when they did not. Through burrowing, mammals added another layer to their quiet strategy of survival. They did not seek to dominate open spaces, but to create their own, hidden and controlled. In doing so, they carried their lineage forward through eras defined by change, wrapped in earth, guided by memory, and protected by the simple depth of soil. As forests thickened and canopies layered themselves high above the ground, some mammals began to look upward rather than downward. Trunks and branches offered a different kind of refuge, one defined by height, flexibility, and distance from heavy footsteps below. Life in the trees unfolded in filtered light and shifting leaves, where movement could be quick and directional rather than hidden. For mammals willing to climb, the canopy became a world apart, suspended and relatively calm. Bodies adjusted gradually to this vertical space. Limbs lengthened and became more mobile at the joints, allowing careful gripping and controlled leaps. Digits spread and curved, finding purchase on bark and narrow branches. Tails extended into balancing tools, stabilizing movement across gaps and uneven surfaces. These changes were not extravagant, but precise, shaping animals that could navigate complex three-dimensional paths without wasting energy or drawing attention. Fossils preserve hints of these lives through delicate bones shaped for climbing rather than running. Wrist and ankle joints suggest rotation and flexibility, while shoulder blades angled in ways that supported upward reach. In some lineages, membranes of skin stretched between limbs, transforming simple leaps into controlled glides. These early gliders crossed open spaces between trees, descending gently rather than falling, using air as an ally rather than a hazard. The canopy became not just a place to stand, but a medium to move through. Above the forest floor, danger took on a different texture. Large predators were less common, and movement was harder to detect through dense leaves and layered branches. Nesting sites, found in forks and hollows, offered stability and concealment. Food arrived in new forms: fruits, seeds, insects, and tender plant tissues concentrated in sunlight-rich zones. Living higher meant access to resources that renewed quickly and were scattered enough to limit competition. The fossil record suggests that these arboreal mammals were neither rare nor accidental. Multiple lineages show similar adaptations, shaped independently by similar demands. This repetition reveals how consistently the canopy rewarded certain traits. Over time, these early climbers refined behaviors centered on balance, memory, and spatial awareness. Their nervous systems adapted to judge distance and angle with quiet precision, turning complex landscapes into familiar routes. These forms echo strongly in later mammals that would reappear long after the Mesozoic closed. Modern squirrels, for example, move through trees with a familiarity built on the same principles: grasping limbs, stabilizing tails, and confident leaps guided by experience. Though separated by deep time, the resemblance is not coincidence, but parallel invention, shaped by the enduring logic of arboreal life. In the trees, mammals found a space where dominance mattered less than coordination and patience. Canopies did not belong to any single giant. They belonged to those who could move lightly and adapt quickly. By rising above the ground, mammals expanded their living world once again, adding height to their strategy of survival and carrying quiet diversity into spaces where the forest itself offered shelter and continuity. Food shaped the daily boundaries of mammal life more quietly than claws or shelter, yet it influenced survival with steady force. In landscapes dominated by larger bodies, mammals thrived by eating what was overlooked rather than contested. Insects stirred beneath bark and soil, seeds scattered across forest floors, eggs rested briefly in exposed nests, and small prey moved through cover with little notice. These modest sources formed a dependable web of nourishment, renewing themselves quickly and rarely attracting competition from giants above. Insects were among the most reliable of these resources, Beetles, larvae, and soft bodied invertebrates appeared in nearly every environment and at nearly every season. Mammals that specialized in detecting movement and scent could feed consistently without traveling far. Seeds and nuts added another layer of stability, storing energy through dry or cold periods when other food became scarce. Some mammals learned to crack tough shells or grind fibrous material, turning what seemed inaccessible into sustenance. Eggs and small vertebrates offered dense nutrition during brief windows of opportunity. These meals were not pursued through open chase, but through timing and awareness, collected quietly and consumed quickly. Such feeding required precision rather than strength, an ability to recognize opportunity and retreat without leaving traces. These moments added variety to diets already broad, increasing resilience rather than replacing simpler foods. Teeth reveal much of this story. Fossilized jaws preserve patterns shaped by repeated use, with cusps, ridges, and basins arranged to match specific feeding habits. Sharp pointed teeth suggest piercing and gripping insects, while broader surfaces indicate grinding and crushing. Some mammals carried mixed dentition, allowing them to process different foods without specialization becoming a trap. Where marks record contact with hard seeds or abrasive material, subtle signatures of meals long gone. This dental diversity mattered because it allowed mammals to adjust rather than commit. Flexible diets reduced dependence on any single resource, buffering populations against seasonal shifts and environmental change. When insects declined, seeds remained. When plants failed, small prey filled gaps. This adaptability reduced the need for constant movement or territorial expansion, keeping mammals within familiar ranges where shelter and memory offered additional protection. Size played a smaller role than often assumed. Larger animals required stable, abundant food sources, while mammals with modest bodies could survive on scattered calories. Their energy needs aligned with foods that renewed quickly, keeping survival tied to local cycles rather than broad dominance. Flexibility favored endurance over growth, persistence over presence. Through diet, mammals learned to live between extremes. They neither starved nor surged, but followed steady paths shaped by availability rather than ambition. Teeth, senses, and behavior aligned around this quiet balance, allowing mammals to persist across long stretches of time. In doing so, they carried forward a lesson that would echo long after the Mesozoic closed. Survival often belongs to those who eat widely, move carefully, and remain ready to change when the land itself shifts beneath them. The presence of dinosaurs shaped mammal evolution, even when the two rarely crossed paths directly. Their influence spread outward through the structure of ecosystems, altering space, time, and opportunity. Massive bodies controlled the open ground, long strides defined movement across plains, and sheer size redirected the flow of energy through food webs. Mammals evolved within this landscape of consequence, adapting not to constant contact, but to the conditions such dominance created. Body size remained constrained, not by incapacity, but by consequence. Growing larger demanded visibility, greater food intake, and exposure to spaces already occupied by giants. For mammals, restraint preserved freedom. Smaller forms slipped through the ecological gaps left behind, feeding where others could not, and sheltering where size became a barrier. Expansion occurred slowly, measured in cautious steps rather than sudden leaps. Evolution favored forms that could persist quietly rather than press outward aggressively. This pressure did not halt change, but redirected it. Instead of investing energy in scale, mammals invested in refinement. Senses sharpened, behaviors became flexible, and internal systems grew efficient. Reproduction adapted toward care and protection, allowing fewer young to reach maturity with greater reliability. Brains increased in complexity relative to body size, supporting memory and learning rather than brute force. These changes unfolded gradually, shaped by the need to respond to a world already claimed. Dinosaurs also shaped the tempo of mammal life. Activity patterns shifted into hours when larger animals rested, altering circadian rhythms across generations. Shelter became a central concern, leading mammals into burrows, trees, and dense cover. These choices reduced direct competition while exposing mammals to new selective pressures. Navigating darkness, confined spaces, and complex terrain demanded coordination and awareness, traits that slowly embedded themselves into mammalian design. The long shadow of dinosaurs also narrowed the paths available for experimentation. Lineages that strayed too far into exposed niches often vanished, leaving little trace behind. Those that endured were shaped by repeated filtering, each generation tested against the same constraints. This filtering did not produce dominance, but consistency. Mammals became specialists in surviving alongside overwhelming presence, not by resisting it, but by adapting around it. Through millions of years, this constant pressure created a lineage comfortable with limitation. Growth occurred inward rather than outward, refining systems rather than enlarging forms. When environments shifted, mammals responded with adjustment rather than collapse, accustomed to change imposed from above. Their evolutionary pace remained steady, rarely explosive, shaped by patience rather than opportunity. By the time the world finally changed again, mammals carried the imprint of this long coexistence. Their history beneath towering forms had prepared them for endurance rather than expansion. The shadow that once restrained them had also shaped them, leaving behind creatures built to persist through imbalance, capable of surviving within pressure long before freedom ever arrived. Reproduction quietly shaped mammal survival as much as movement or diet, unfolding away from open ground and constant exposure. Early mammals invested in strategies that favored protection over abundance, shaping life from its earliest moments with care rather than chance. In environments where sudden loss was common, this approach offered a steadier path forward, one generation carrying the next through guarded beginnings. Instead of releasing large numbers of vulnerable offspring into uncertain conditions, many early mammals shifted toward fewer young with greater investment. Live birth emerged within certain lineages as an extension of this pattern, allowing development to begin within the safety of the body rather than the open world. Growth occurred in controlled conditions, sheltered from temperature swings, predators, and immediate environmental shocks. This internal beginning slowed reproduction, but increased the likelihood that each offspring would survive long enough to mature. Parental care did not end at birth. Nursing provided nourishment that adjusted to developmental needs, transforming the parent's body into a reliable source of energy. Milk carried not only calories, but protection, supporting immune defenses during fragile early stages. This bond kept young close, anchoring them to shelter rather than exposure. The rhythm of feeding, resting, and gradual exploration created a controlled introduction to the world beyond safety. These behaviors reshaped anatomy and behavior together. Mammal bodies adapted to carry developing young, while instincts evolved toward vigilance and protection. Nests, burrows, and hidden spaces gained renewed importance as places where care could unfold without interruption. Time itself became a resource, stretched across extended periods of growth rather than condensed into rapid development. Such strategies offered particular advantages in unstable environments. Climate shifts, food shortages, and sudden disturbances could erase entire cohorts of exposed young, but protected offspring remained buffered from immediate effects. When surface conditions became hostile, parents could delay emergence, adjust feeding, or relocate shelters rather than abandon young entirely. This flexibility increased survival odds without demanding physical dominance or speed. Parental care also supported learning. Young mammals absorbed information through proximity, mapping safe paths, food sources, and shelters through observation and repetition. Memory formed early, guided by shared spaces rather than instinct alone. This transfer of experience allowed behavior to adapt more rapidly than anatomy, offering resilience during periods of environmental change. Over generations, these reproductive patterns shaped population dynamics. Growth remained slow and steady, avoiding dramatic booms that could collapse under stress. Losses still occurred, but recovery followed familiar patterns rather than chaotic expansion. The lineage persisted through consistency, not excess. In a world defined by unpredictability, early mammal reproduction favored continuity. Life was introduced gently, guided through early vulnerability by sustained care. This approach did not guarantee survival, but it shifted the balance toward endurance. Through quiet investment in the next generation, mammals carried themselves forward across shifting eras, sheltered by patience, presence, and the steady work of raising life carefully in a restless world. Long before the sky darkened at the end of the Cretaceous, life endured repeated moments of loss. The Mesozoic was not a smooth age of uninterrupted stability, but a landscape shaped by recurring disruption. Continents drifted, seas advanced and retreated, and climates shifted in ways that quietly erased lineages already adapted to narrow conditions. Mammals lived through these changes one after another, often surviving, sometimes disappearing, always shaped by forces far beyond their control. Volcanic activity marked several of these turning points. Vast eruptions released ash and gases that altered air and water alike, dimming sunlight and reshaping temperature patterns over long spans of time. Forests thinned or vanished, food webs fractured, and familiar habitats became unreliable. Even when eruptions occurred far from mammal populations, their effects traveled widely, carried through climate and chemistry rather than flame. Survival depended on flexibility, and not all lineages carried enough of it. Climate shifts followed their own slow rhythms. Periods of warming expanded forests and inland seas, while cooler phases contracted habitats and increased seasonal extremes. Rainfall patterns changed, altering vegetation and the insects and small animals that depended on it. Mammals adapted when they could, adjusting behavior and diet, but specialization became a risk during these transitions. Lineages tied too closely to a single environment faded quietly as conditions moved beyond their tolerance. The fossil record preserves these losses unevenly, yet the pattern remains clear. Mammal diversity rose and fell multiple times throughout the Mesozoic, not in a single downward arc, but in waves. Some groups flourished briefly, then vanished without descendants. Others persisted across several disruptions before eventually disappearing. Extinction was rarely dramatic at the scale of individuals, but decisive across generations, thinning branches that had taken millions of years to form. These early losses shaped what remained. Each extinction reduced variety, narrowing the pool of traits carried forward. Survivors were not necessarily superior, but compatible with the conditions that followed. This repeated filtering reshaped mammal evolution long before the final catastrophe arrived. What endured was a lineage already accustomed to absence, built from remnants rather than abundance. Importantly, many mammal groups that lived alongside dinosaurs never reached the asteroid's shadow. They disappeared earlier, their endings tied to warming seas, cooling interiors, collapsing forests, or prolonged volcanic winters. The story of mammal survival is therefore not centered on a single moment of crisis, but on endurance across many quieter ones. By the time the Mesozoic neared its close, mammals had already absorbed the effects of repeated erasure. Their history was marked by survival within instability, shaped by adaptation and loss in equal measure. The asteroid would change the world abruptly, but it did not introduce extinction to mammal life. That lesson had already been written into their deep past, etched across eras that ended not with fire from the sky, but with slow changes that left no room to remain. When the asteroid struck, the planet changed with a speed unlike anything mammals had known before. Shockwaves rippled through rock and water, forests ignited, and dust rose high into the atmosphere. Sunlight dimmed as ash and debris spread across the sky, cooling the surface and interrupting the steady rhythms that had governed ecosystems for millions of years. Food chains fractured almost at once, not through a single blow, but through the sudden absence of light and growing cold that followed. In the days and weeks after the impact, darkness lingered, photosynthesis slowed, then failed in many places, and plant life withered back. Insects declined, larger animals starved, and landscapes grew quieter as movement faded. Oceans absorbed heat unevenly, altering currents and coastal conditions. This was not an instant silence, but a drawn-out hush settling over land and sea alike, reshaping survival into a question of immediacy rather than long-term balance. Small mammals endured this upheaval not through strength, but through the habits they had already refined. Shelter mattered more than territory. Burrows, crevices, hollow logs, and underground chambers provided insulation against falling temperatures and protection from fire and debris. Below the surface, conditions changed more slowly, allowing bodies to conserve energy and avoid the worst extremes unfolding above. Diet also played a decisive role. Mammals that fed broadly could switch resources as environments collapsed. Seeds stored in soil, roots beneath the surface, insects sheltered underground, and carrion from fallen animals provided temporary nourishment. This flexibility reduced dependence on any single food source, allowing survival through scarcity rather than abundance. Eating little, but often, aligned well with smaller bodies and lower energy needs. Short reproductive cycles added another layer of resilience. Mammals reproduced quickly compared to larger animals, allowing populations to recover incrementally once conditions stabilized even slightly. Losses occurred, but recovery did not depend on long maturation or delayed breeding. When shelter and food permitted, new generations appeared within familiar spaces, restoring presence without dramatic expansion. Behavior shifted as well. Activity slowed, conserving energy. Movement became cautious and limited, guided by memory rather than exploration. Mammals waited rather than wandered, remaining close to shelter and known resources. This patience carried them through weeks and seasons when the surface world remained unreliable. Survival during this immediate aftermath was uneven and incomplete. Many mammal lineages still vanished, unable to adapt quickly enough, or trapped in habitats that failed entirely. Yet enough endured to carry the lineage forward. Their success did not arise from novelty introduced by the asteroid, but from traits shaped long before it arrived. Shelter seeking, flexible diets, and efficient reproduction had already been tested across earlier disruptions. As the dust slowly settled and light returned, Mammals emerged into a changed world. The immediate crisis had passed unevenly, leaving behind absences as well as openings. For mammals, the asteroid marked not a sudden beginning, but the end of one long period of endurance and the quiet transition into another, shaped by what had already allowed them to remain. Survival carried mammals into a world that felt open yet uncertain. The disappearance of dinosaurs did not immediately translate into opportunity, but into imbalance. Landscapes emptied of familiar pressures did not settle quickly. Plant communities shifted unevenly, climates oscillated, and food webs reassembled through trial rather than design. For mammals that endured the catastrophe, persistence marked only the first step into a far more complex chapter. As environments slowly stabilized, mammals encountered one another in new ways. Spaces once avoided became accessible, and diets that had overlapped quietly now collided more often. Competition increased, not between giants and the small, but among mammals themselves, each lineage carrying its own strategies shaped by deep time. Burrowers met climbers, generalists crossed paths with specialists, and survival depended on how well traits matched emerging conditions rather than past resilience. Growth did not follow a simple upward trend. Some mammals expanded rapidly into new habitats, while others remained confined to shrinking niches. Body size increased in certain lineages, but with it came higher energy demands and greater exposure to instability. Those that grew too quickly often found themselves poorly suited to fluctuating resources, their advantages fading as climates cooled or vegetation shifted. Adaptation remained uneven, favoring flexibility over momentum. The fossil record reflects this mixed outcome. Diversity rose in some regions while declining in others, leaving a patchwork rather than a surge. Many lineages that had survived fire, darkness, and scarcity vanished quietly in the centuries and millennia that followed. Their extinction was not tied to singular events, but to prolonged mismatch with changing environments. Survival had preserved them through crisis, yet offered no guarantee against gradual loss. Reproductive strategies and diet continued to shape success. Mammals with shorter life cycles adjusted more easily to shifting conditions, while those bound to slower growth struggled. Dietary specialists faced renewed risk as ecosystems reorganized, while generalists navigated scarcity with broader options. Competition favored those capable of switching behaviors and resources without abandoning familiar shelter and territory. Geography also played a role. Continents remained in motion, separating populations and reshaping climates. Isolation allowed some mammals to thrive in relative calm, while others faced intensified pressure as habitats fragmented. Movement across land bridges created encounters that reshuffled dominance locally but offered little security long term. Each expansion carried risk alongside opportunity. This post extinction world demanded a different kind of endurance. It required adjustment not to sudden loss, but to prolonged uncertainty. Mammals that had survived the worst moment now faced a quieter test, one measured in generations rather than days. Many failed this test, leaving behind only scattered bones as evidence of paths that once seemed viable. What remained was not the full diversity that had passed through the extinction, but a narrowing set of lineages shaped by extended pressure. Success emerged slowly, filtered through competition, climate, and chance. Survival had opened the door, but what followed determined who would remain inside. As the world continued to settle after the Great Disruption, certain mammal lineages began to hold their ground more firmly than others. Their success did not arrive in sudden waves or dramatic takeovers, but through gradual alignment with the reshaped Earth. Among these were the early ancestors of placentals, marsupials, and monotremes, groups whose foundations had been laid long before, yet now found conditions that favored their particular strengths. They moved forward quietly, shaped by continuity rather than novelty. Placentals expanded through their ability to support longer development before birth. This extended gestation allowed young to arrive more fully formed, increasing early survival in environments that still shifted unpredictably. Marsupials followed a different path, giving birth earlier and completing development within protected pouches. This strategy allowed flexibility in uncertain conditions, reducing the cost of pregnancy while maintaining close parental care. Monotremes, retaining egg laying alongside mammalian traits, occupied ecological spaces where this blend of strategies remained effective. Each approach reflected a balance between protection, energy use, and environmental tolerance. What united these groups was not reproductive similarity, but adaptability. Their bodies and behaviors supported varied diets, from insects and plant material to small prey, allowing them to move across emerging ecosystems without strict dependence on single resources. Sensory systems refined during long periods of pressure now guided exploration into open ground, forest edges, and waterways. Limbs diversified, supporting running, climbing, digging, and swimming, each movement pattern opening access to different habitats. As niches emptied, these mammals expanded cautiously rather than explosively. Grasslands, recovering forests, and coastal regions presented opportunities, yet conditions remained unstable. Those that succeeded did so by matching pace with environment, spreading gradually while maintaining familiar shelters and feeding strategies. Expansion did not erase competition, but it reduced extremes, allowing populations to establish themselves without exhausting resources. Geography shaped this spread. Continents continued to drift, separating populations and encouraging divergence. Isolation allowed local adaptation to refine traits without constant pressure from distant competitors. Over time, this produced distinct regional lineages, each suited to specific climates and landscapes. Movement across land bridges connected some groups briefly, reshaping distributions while preserving underlying differences. The fossil record captures this period as one of widening paths rather than singular dominance. Diversity increased, though unevenly, and some lineages flourished while others held steady without major change. The mammals that endured were those whose earlier restraint now translated into stability. They were prepared to persist rather than overwhelm, to occupy space without demanding control over it. Through this slow expansion, placentals, marsupials, and monotremes became anchors for the future. Their success emerged from long-tested traits rather than sudden advantage. In the quiet opening left behind by vanished giants, they established patterns of life that would continue to unfold, grounded in flexibility, careful growth, and the steady confidence of having survived before. Even after the disappearance of dinosaurs reshaped the living world, loss continued in quieter forms. The fossil record shows that many mammal lineages did not persist far into this new era, despite having survived the catastrophe that ended so many others. Their remains appear briefly in post-extinction layers, then fade, leaving behind traces of lives that flourished only momentarily before slipping away. Survival had carried them forward, but continuation demanded alignment with conditions still in motion. Some of these mammals expanded rapidly as environments opened. Freed from long-standing pressures, their populations grew and spread into landscapes that had been inaccessible for millions of years. This early success left a strong but narrow signal in the fossil record, concentrated within short spans of time. Their bodies and behaviors, however, often reflected past conditions rather than emerging ones. When climates shifted again or vegetation changed pace, these same traits became liabilities instead of strengths. Ecological instability played a central role in these losses. The post dinosaur world was uneven, with warming periods followed by cooling phases, forests advancing and retreating, and coastlines redrawn by shifting seas. Mammals that relied on specific habitats or narrow diets struggled as these patterns fluctuated. Regions that once supported abundance transformed gradually but decisively, leaving specialists without the flexibility needed to adapt. Competition among mammals intensified this pressure. As more lineages explored similar spaces, overlap increased. Those with slower reproduction, higher energy demands, or limited dietary range found themselves displaced rather than dominant. Even small differences in timing or behavior could decide which lineages endured. Extinction during this period rarely came from dramatic collapse, but from gradual exclusion as others proved better suited to shifting balances. Fossil deposits record this pattern as a thinning rather than a break. Teeth and bones become rarer, then disappear, replaced by remains of mammals that carried broader adaptability. Some vanished lineages show no evidence of decline during the extinction itself, suggesting that their end arrived later through sustained mismatch rather than sudden event. Their disappearance unfolded over generations, unnoticed by the ecosystems continuing to evolve around them. Geography further shaped these outcomes. Isolated populations faced heightened risk as climates changed locally. Without corridors for movement or mixing, adaptation slowed. In contrast, lineages spread across wider ranges could retreat or advance with shifting conditions. Those confined by geography often peaked early, then vanished once environments diverged beyond their tolerance. These losses remind us that survival is never a single achievement. Passing through catastrophe did not shield mammals from the demands of a restless world. Many lineages that seemed well positioned for success found themselves outpaced by change itself. Their disappearance did not erase their importance, but it narrowed the paths available for what followed. The post-dinosaur era was not a simple story of ascent. It was shaped by experimentation, expansion, and continued loss. The mammals that remained were shaped not only by what they survived, but by what quietly failed to endure beside them. The early Cenozoic opened beneath unsettled skies. After the long upheaval that closed the Mesozoic, climate did not settle into calm, but moved through sharp swings that reshaped the planet repeatedly. Periods of rapid warming raised global temperatures, followed by cooling intervals that tightened ecosystems once again. Ice retreated and returned at the poles, sea levels advanced inland and then withdrew, and atmospheric patterns shifted faster than many living systems could stabilize. These changes altered the texture of the land itself. Forests spread across regions that had once been dry, then fragmented as climates cooled or rainfall patterns shifted. Grasslands began to appear in patches, reshaping how energy moved through ecosystems. Rivers changed course, wetlands expanded and contracted, and coastlines slid back and forth over continental edges. Each shift redrew boundaries that mammals relied on, turning familiar territories into transitional spaces. Mammals responded unevenly. Generalists adjusted by following the movement of habitats, modifying diet and behavior to match new conditions. Some expanded their ranges gradually, tracking food and shelter across changing landscapes. Others remained anchored to specific environments that no longer persisted. For these specialized groups, climate change did not arrive as a single disruption, but as repeated pressure applied from different directions. Rapid warming altered plant communities first. Temperature-tolerant species spread quickly, while others retreated or disappeared. Insects responded in turn, changing seasonal availability and abundance. Mammals dependent on particular plants or prey felt these shifts immediately. Cooling phases reverse some of these patterns, compressing habitats and shortening growing seasons. The rhythm of expansion and contraction favored adaptability over precision. Physiology also played a role. Body size influenced how mammals handled temperature change, with some forms better suited to dissipating heat and others better insulated against cold. Species adapted to narrow temperature ranges struggled as extremes grew more common. What had once been stable became intermittent, and traits shaped for constancy now faced uncertainty. The fossil record shows this stress clearly. Certain mammal groups flourish briefly during favorable conditions, then decline as climates swing away from their preferences. Teeth and bones appear in abundance within specific layers, then taper off as environments transformed. Their disappearance was gradual, unfolding over thousands of years rather than moments, shaped by repeated mismatch rather than sudden collapse. Ecosystems themselves became more fluid. Migration routes shifted, bringing species into new contact while separating others. Competition intensified in shrinking habitats and loosened during expansions, creating uneven pressure across regions. Mammals that relied on tight ecological relationships found fewer anchors, while those capable of flexible associations endured. Through these climate cycles, the early Cenozoic became a testing ground. Survival favored lineages that could move, adjust, and persist through repeated transitions. For others, precision proved costly. The climate did not choose winners intentionally, but its constant reshaping filtered life through change alone. As temperatures rose and fell, mammals carried forward not certainty, but resilience shaped by motion. The early Cenozoic did not offer rest after catastrophe. It offered a world in flux, where endurance depended on living with instability rather than waiting for it to pass. As the Cenozoic unfolded, the surface of the planet continued its slow, patient rearrangement. Continents drifted apart or pressed together, carrying entire ecosystems with them. Oceans widened, mountain ranges rose, and shallow seas receded, redrawing the map that mammals followed, willingly or not. Geography became an invisible guide, shaping survival not through force, but through position. Land bridges appeared and vanished with changes in sea level, briefly connecting worlds that had long been separate. These passages allowed mammals to move into unfamiliar territories, carrying their traits into new settings. Some migrations unfolded gradually, others in short windows that closed as quietly as they opened. When connections vanished, populations were left behind, isolated by water, climate, or rising terrain. Movement gave way to separation, and with it, new evolutionary paths began. Isolation reshaped mammals from the inside out. Populations confined to particular regions adapted to local conditions with increasing precision. Diets narrowed or shifted, body sizes changed, and behaviors aligned with specific climates and resources. Over time, these isolated groups became distinct, shaped less by what they shared with distant relatives and more by what their immediate surroundings demanded. Adaptation accelerated, but flexibility often declined. For some mammals, isolation proved protective. Regions spared from intense competition allowed lineages to persist with fewer pressures, maintaining stable populations across long stretches of time. For others, confinement became a trap. When climates shifted or food sources dwindled, escape was impossible. Without access to new habitats or genetic exchange, these populations declined, leaving behind fossils that mark both their uniqueness and their end. Extinction during this period often followed geography as closely as biology. Species well suited to their environment disappeared not because they failed to adapt, but because their environment itself vanished or transformed beyond recognition. Rising seas submerged coastal plains, cooling temperatures reshaped forests, and drying interiors fractured once continuous habitats. Location determined exposure to these changes as much as physical traits did. Continental separation also shaped diversity unevenly. Some landmasses became laboratories of evolution, producing mammals found nowhere else. Others became crossroads, where repeated migrations introduced competition and replacement. Success depended not only on adaptability, but on timing and placement within these shifting networks. Arriving early could mean opportunity. Arriving late could mean exclusion. Through this constant rearrangement, geography quietly filtered mammal life. Survival favored those whose traits aligned with both environment and position, while others faded despite strong adaptation. Biology provided tools, but location determined how and when those tools were tested. In this drifting world, mammals were shaped as much by where they lived as by how they lived. Continents moved without urgency, yet their motion carried lasting consequences. Isolation, connection, and separation worked together to narrow the vast range of possibilities into the patterns that endured, reminding us that evolution unfolds not only within bodies, but across the shifting face of the earth itself. As mammals explored new spaces and roles, some lineages began to grow larger, testing the limits of bodies shaped for restraint. Size promised reach, strength, and access to resources once guarded by giants. Yet this shift carried risks that unfolded slowly and often invisibly. Growth altered how mammals interacted with their environments, tying survival more tightly to conditions that rarely remained stable. Larger bodies demanded more energy. Muscles required fuel, organs required maintenance, and movement across wider territories consumed time and calories. This placed greater pressure on food availability, especially in landscapes still adjusting after repeated environmental change. When vegetation shifted or prey declined, larger mammals felt the strain first. Their bodies, once an advantage, became liabilities that required constant replenishment. Food sources themselves were uneven. Periods of abundance alternated with scarcity, and ecosystems rarely supported sustained excess. Mammals that grew rapidly often relied on specific diets capable of meeting their energy needs. When those resources faltered, flexibility narrowed. Smaller mammals survived on scattered calories, while larger forms faced gaps that could not be bridged easily. Hunger arrived sooner and lingered longer. Reproduction added another layer of risk. Larger mammals tended to reproduce more slowly, investing heavily in fewer offspring. This strategy worked under stable conditions, but offered limited resilience when environments fluctuated. Losses could not be replaced quickly, and populations declined gradually but decisively. Smaller mammals recovered faster, their shorter life cycles aligning better with unpredictable change. The fossil record reflects this imbalance clearly. Many large-bodied mammal lineages appear briefly, peak, and then vanish as climates shifted or ecosystems transformed. Their disappearance often coincides with periods of cooling, drying, or habitat fragmentation, when energy demands exceeded supply. These extinctions were not sudden, but followed patterns tied closely to size and metabolic need. Competition further amplified these pressures. As mammals diversified, overlap increased. Larger forms required larger territories and higher quality resources, placing them in direct competition with others expanding into similar niches. When conditions tightened, smaller and more flexible species often outlasted their heavier counterparts, occupying spaces that demanded less investment to survive. Size also influenced exposure. Bigger bodies moved through open landscapes more visibly, increasing vulnerability to environmental extremes. Heat waves, cold snaps, and droughts affected them more acutely, with fewer places to retreat. Shelter that suited smaller mammals offered little protection to those that had outgrown hidden spaces. Through these patterns, it became clear that growth alone did not guarantee success. Bigger was not better in a world defined by fluctuation. Survival favored balance, not expansion beyond what environments could sustain. Mammals that persisted were those whose size matched opportunity without exceeding it. In the quiet record left behind, body size emerges as both a path and a boundary. The history of mammals shows repeated experiments with scale, many of which ended quietly when the cost outweighed the gain. What endured was not the largest form, but the one best aligned with a restless world that rarely rewarded excess. As the great reptiles faded into absence, mammals no longer lived beneath a single overwhelming presence. Instead, they encountered one another more often, meeting in shared spaces that had once been avoided or divided by necessity. The pressure that followed did not arrive as open conflict, but as steady overlap. Diets intersected, shelters became contested, and familiar routines unfolded alongside unfamiliar competitors. The world felt fuller, even as it remained unsettled. Competition among mammals reshaped survival quietly. Lineages that had once thrived by avoiding attention now faced close neighbors with similar needs. Burrowers encountered other burrowers. Climbers met climbers in the same canopies. Generalists crossed paths repeatedly, each drawing from overlapping resources. When food thinned or climates shifted, these intersections sharpened. Survival depended less on enduring harsh conditions and more on outperforming similar bodies in shared environments. Replacement became more common than coexistence. Rather than stabilizing into balanced communities, mammals often displaced one another over time. Slight differences in reproduction rate, growth speed, or dietary range accumulated across generations. A lineage that bred faster filled territory more quickly. One that processed food more efficiently weathered scarcity with less loss. These advantages did not announce themselves immediately, but gradually shifted population balance until one presence faded. The fossil record preserves this pattern as succession rather than harmony. Teeth and bones belonging to one group appear consistently in layers, then decline as another becomes dominant in the same region. These transitions rarely align with dramatic environmental change. Instead, they suggest steady pressure applied through competition alone. The environment remained suitable, yet only one lineage endured within it. Evolutionary winners were not always larger, stronger, or more specialized. Often, they were more flexible. Mammals capable of adjusting diet, modifying behavior, or reproducing under varied conditions persisted when others did not. Small advantages compounded quietly, reshaping communities without sudden disruption. Losers were not failures of design, but outcomes of mismatch within narrowing margins. Competition also favored expansion into new behaviors. Lineages that avoided overlap by shifting activity patterns or exploiting underused resources found space to persist. Others remained bound to familiar strategies that no longer offered security. Over time, this divergence separated those that endured from those replaced, not through direct struggle, but through persistent difference. Geography influenced these outcomes as well. In isolated regions, competition unfolded slowly, allowing prolonged coexistence. In connected landscapes, contact accelerated replacement. Movement brought encounters. Encounters intensified pressure, and pressure shaped evolutionary direction. The same traits that supported success in one place led to decline in another. Through this period, mammal evolution became a story of narrowing paths. Diversity remained, but it was filtered through competition that allowed fewer lineages to occupy similar roles. The survivors carried traits honed not only by environment, but by comparison against close relatives. In this quiet sorting, mammals reshaped their own future. The absence of dinosaurs did not remove struggle, it redirected it inward. What followed was not peace, but a gradual refinement of presence, where enduring meant fitting better than those nearby, again and again, across the slow passage of time. Population history leaves marks that do not fade quickly, even when environments appear to recover. After waves of extinction and competition had reshaped mammal life, many surviving lineages passed through periods when their numbers dropped sharply. These genetic bottlenecks occurred quietly, sometimes without obvious changes in the surrounding world. A species could persist across wide regions, yet be reduced to a fraction of its former diversity, carrying forward only a narrow sample of what once existed. Evidence for these crashes appears indirectly, preserved within patterns rather than dramatic events. Fossil records show sudden reductions in abundance, layers where once common mammals become rare before slowly returning. Genetic studies of modern mammals echo this history, revealing limited variation that points to past constriction. These signals suggest moments when survival hinged on very few individuals, their descendants spreading outward again once conditions allowed. Reduced diversity followed naturally. When populations shrink, variation narrows, and traits once widespread may vanish entirely. Characteristics linked to resilience or specialization can be lost by chance alone, replaced by what happened to persist within the small group that survived. As populations expanded again, they carried this reduced genetic toolkit forward, shaping all future adaptation from a thinner foundation. This loss did not always threaten immediate survival. Many mammals thrived despite reduced diversity, spreading across new habitats and filling ecological roles effectively. Yet the long-term consequences remained subtle and enduring. With fewer genetic options available, future adaptation became more constrained. When climates shifted or new pressures emerged, these lineages responded within tighter limits, relying on modification rather than reinvention. Some modern patterns trace directly back to these ancient bottlenecks. Groups with wide distributions but low genetic variation reflect expansion from small ancestral populations. Physical similarities across distant regions, limited tolerance for environmental extremes, and recurring vulnerability to disease all carry echoes of past restriction. What appears stable on the surface often rests on a history of near loss. Bottlenecks also shaped evolutionary direction. Traits present within surviving individuals became amplified as populations grew, not because they were optimal, but because they were available. This process locked certain forms and behaviors into place, guiding future evolution along paths set by chance as much as selection. Diversity lost was rarely regained in full, even across millions of years. These patterns reveal survival as a layered process, Enduring an extinction event did not preserve a lineage intact, it reshaped it, trimming possibilities and narrowing outcomes. Mammals emerged from these bottlenecks altered, their future shaped by what had slipped through rather than what had been left behind. Today, the legacy of these population crashes remains written into living bodies. The mammals that surround us carry histories not only of growth and expansion, but of severe reduction followed by recovery. Their success stands alongside quiet limitations inherited from deep time, reminders that survival often leaves lasting marks. Genetic bottlenecks did not end mammal evolution, but they guided it subtly, ensuring that the present remains closely tied to moments when continuation itself hung by a fragile thread. Across the long narrowing of time, a small subset of mammal lineages carried forward traits that aligned quietly with endurance. These survivors were not defined by spectacle or scale, but by patterns that repeated reliably across shifting worlds. Their bodies, behaviors, and life histories reflected an emphasis on flexibility, allowing them to move through instability without breaking against it. What persisted was not a single form, but a shared way of meeting change. Flexibility appeared first in how these mammals lived day to day. They occupied multiple habitats rather than a single narrow setting, moving between forest edges, open ground, and sheltered spaces as conditions allowed. Their diets followed the same principle. Insects, seeds, roots, small animals, and occasional carrion all contributed nourishment. This generalist approach reduced reliance on any one resource and softened the impact of sudden loss. When one food waned, another remained. Adaptability extended beyond diet into behavior. Activity patterns shifted with temperature and season, guided by opportunity rather than fixed schedules. Shelter use remained fluid, with burrows, nests, crevices, and vegetation all serving protective roles depending on place and moment. Reproduction adjusted to conditions as well, favoring steady investment over rapid expansion. These mammals did not rush to fill space, but maintained continuity within it. Physiology supported this adaptability. Moderate body size balanced energy needs with mobility, allowing survival during scarcity without sacrificing movement. Sensory systems favored awareness over specialization, supporting navigation through varied environments. Limbs and joints accommodated multiple forms of motion rather than a single optimized style. These traits did not maximize performance in any one domain, but ensured competence across many. Over generations, this generalist foundation proved durable. As climates shifted and landscapes reorganized, these mammals responded without requiring fundamental redesign. Evolution modified existing systems rather than replacing them, preserving stability while allowing gradual change. This balance between constancy and adjustment became a defining strength. These same traits persist in modern mammals, not as relics, but as active strategies. Species that thrive today often share this heritage of flexibility. They tolerate a range of temperatures, consume varied foods, and adjust behavior in response to human-altered environments. Even highly specialized mammals carry traces of generalist ancestry, evident in developmental pathways and physiological tolerance. The persistence of these traits reflects the conditions under which they were forged. Mammal survival was shaped less by moments of dominance than by long spans of uncertainty. Selection favored those who could endure repeated testing without exhaustion. Generalist behavior did not produce immediate advantage, but it reduced risk across deep time. In this way, the mammals that became us were not exceptional in isolation. They were consistent, adaptable, and resilient across generations. Their success emerged from alignment with a world that rarely remained still. Modern mammals continue to carry this legacy, moving through environments shaped by both natural change and human influence. The story of these survivors is not one of triumph over others, but of quiet persistence. Traits shaped by ancient instability remain active today, guiding survival in subtle ways. In them, the deep past remains present, expressed through flexibility that continues to sustain mammal life in a changing world. The story mammals left behind is incomplete, not because it was small, but because it was quiet. Much of mammal life unfolded in places where preservation was unlikely, beneath soil, within dense vegetation, or in delicate forms that did not endure long after death. Bones were light and easily scattered. Bodies returned quickly to the cycle of decay. What remains in stone is therefore not a full record, but a partial echo shaped by chance. Preservation favors the large and the exposed. Massive skeletons resting in open floodplains or shallow seas had far greater odds of burial and fossilization. Mammals, by contrast, often lived in sheltered spaces where remains were disturbed by roots, water, or burrowing activity. Many died in environments that erased evidence almost immediately. Even when burial occurred, small bones fractured or dissolved before turning to stone. Time also worked unevenly. Geological processes erased vast stretches of sediment through erosion, removing entire chapters of history. Layers that might have held mammal remains were lifted, tilted, and ground away long before discovery was possible. What survived did so because conditions aligned briefly: rapid burial, stable chemistry, and minimal disturbance. These moments were rare and unevenly distributed across continents. Preservation bias further distorts perception. Certain habitats fossilize better than others, making some lifestyles more visible than they truly were. Mammals living near rivers or floodplains appear more frequently than forest dwellers or burrow specialists. Arboreal species are especially underrepresented, as falls from trees rarely lead to protective burial. This uneven record suggests absence where there was once activity, creating gaps that cannot be filled completely. Even when fossils appear, they often arrive fragmented. Teeth endure better than bones, offering clues to diet but little context for behavior or appearance. Jaws without bodies, isolated vertebrae, and partial limbs dominate collections. Reconstructing entire animals from such pieces requires inference, comparison, and restraint. Many lineages likely existed only briefly, or left remains too scarce to recognize as distinct groups. As a result, diversity is almost certainly underestimated. The mammals we know represent those that intersected momentarily with favorable conditions for preservation. Others moved through time without leaving lasting marks. Their adaptations, behaviors, and interactions are lost not through insignificance, but through circumstance. New discoveries continue to shift this picture. Advances in imaging reveal details once overlooked, and careful study of microfossils uncovers traces hidden within rock. Yet even as understanding grows, it remains bounded by absence. The fossil record is not a complete archive, but a curated collection assembled by geological luck. What we do not see matters as much as what we do. Each gap represents lives lived fully, shaped by environments now vanished. The mammal story is therefore both known and unknown, composed of fragments that hint at a broader reality. Within these missing chapters lies a reminder that survival does not guarantee remembrance, and that much of Earth's deep history will always remain just beyond the reach of stone. New discoveries continue to soften and reshape the mammal story, adding depth to a picture once drawn only in outlines. Fossils found in unexpected places have revealed forms that blur boundaries, combining traits once thought separate. These remains often appear as small, fragmented pieces, yet together they expand the range of known diversity and behavior. Each discovery does not overturn what came before, but adjusts it, refining timelines and relationships with greater subtlety. Recent fossil finds have filled quiet spaces in the record. Mammals preserved in ancient river deposits, lake beds, and volcanic ash layers offer clearer glimpses of anatomy and posture. Delicate structures, such as inner ears, tiny bones of the jaw, and impressions of fur or skin, have survived under rare conditions. These details reveal lifestyles that were once inferred only indirectly, showing how mammals moved, sensed, and interacted with their surroundings. Even single teeth, when placed carefully within context, have revised assumptions about diet and ecology. Technology has expanded what fossils can offer without disturbing them. Advanced imaging allows researchers to peer inside stone, tracing internal structures in 3 dimensions. Hidden cavities, growth patterns, and fine channels for nerves and blood vessels become visible, turning solid rock into layered information. These tools reveal development and physiology, showing how bodies formed and functioned rather than only how they appeared. Genetic methods add another dimension. While ancient DNA rarely survives from deep time, comparisons among living mammals carry echoes of long vanished ancestors. Molecular data helps trace relationships suggested by fossils, confirming some connections and questioning others. Patterns of divergence align with geological change, supporting links between evolution, climate, and movement across continents. Genes preserve memory where stone falls silent. Together, these approaches change how stories are told. The mammal past no longer appears as a sequence of isolated forms, but as a woven network of relationships. Transitional species once invisible now occupy meaningful positions, clarifying how traits emerged and spread. Diversity increases, not through speculation, but through evidence layered carefully into existing frameworks. Importantly, new discoveries also highlight restraint. Each edition brings awareness of how much remains unknown. For every clarified lineage, others remain represented by fragments too sparse to name. Advances sharpen vision, yet they also reveal the scale of absence. The story grows richer, while its boundaries expand further outward. This evolving picture reflects science itself as a living process. Understanding does not settle permanently, but shifts as new data arrives. Interpretations adapt, timelines refine, and models adjust without discarding their foundations. What once seemed settled becomes nuanced, not diminished. In this way, the mammal story continues to unfold long after the animals themselves have vanished. Discovery keeps the narrative open, guided by evidence and patience. Each find adds another quiet note to a long composition, reminding us that deep time is not fixed in stone, but slowly revealed, piece by piece, through careful listening to what the earth is still willing to share. For a long time, early mammals were described as background creatures, present but unimportant, waiting passively for a moment that would finally allow them to matter. This impression did not come from the animals themselves, but from how their story was framed. Compared beside towering dinosaurs, mammals seemed small and easily overlooked, their significance muted by scale rather than substance. Over time, this contrast hardened into myth. One persistent belief holds that early mammals were insignificant because they were small. Size became a shorthand for importance, suggesting that anything modest in form must also be limited in influence. In reality, small size was a functional choice shaped by survival within crowded ecosystems. It allowed access to shelter, reduced energy needs, and supported flexibility across changing conditions. These advantages do not register visually in the fossil record as clearly as large bones, yet they shaped persistence across deep time. Another misconception centers on intelligence. Early mammals are often imagined as simple, instinct driven animals lacking cognitive depth. This view ignores the behavioral demands of their environment. Navigating darkness, confined spaces, complex food webs, and variable climates required memory, sensory integration, and learning. Brain structures preserved in fossil skulls show gradual expansion in regions associated with processing and coordination. Intelligence did not announce itself through dominance, but through effective interaction with intricate surroundings. These myths also persist because evidence arrives unevenly. Fossils favor the dramatic and the durable, reinforcing attention on animals that left large, easily recognized remains. Mammals left finer traces that demand careful study and interpretation. Teeth, jaw fragments, and subtle skeletal features rarely command public imagination in the same way as massive skeletons assembled in museum halls. The story appeared sparse, not because it was empty, but because it required quieter listening. Cultural storytelling reinforced these patterns. Narratives often simplify the past into clear transitions. Dinosaurs ruled, then mammals replaced them. This structure leaves little room for coexistence, complexity, or gradual change. Mammals become placeholders rather than participants, their long history compressed into a prelude for later success. Repetition of this framing allowed assumption to settle into accepted truth. Scientific understanding has moved beyond these ideas, yet public perception often lags behind. Old illustrations, outdated educational models, and familiar phrases continue to circulate. Correcting these impressions requires not new drama, but careful reframing. Early mammals were not waiting for permission to evolve. They were already adapting, diversifying, and responding to pressures long before dominance changed hands. Recognizing this does not diminish dinosaurs or elevate mammals beyond context. It restores balance. Mammals mattered because they endured, experimented, and persisted through restriction rather than expansion. Their success was measured not in immediate impact, but in continuity. As these myths loosen their hold, a fuller picture emerges. Early mammals were not insignificant, unintelligent, or evolutionary placeholders. They were active participants in a complex world, shaping their future quietly across generations. What obscured their importance was never their biology, but the lens through which their story was viewed. History often feels inevitable when viewed from the present, yet the mammal story contains many moments where outcomes balance delicately. Survival paths once branched widely, offering futures that never arrived. Small differences in timing, climate, or geography carried the potential to reshape life across continents. The world we know emerged not because it was the only possible result, but because it was one of a few that endured. Different survival paths could have led to landscapes filled with unfamiliar mammals. Some lineages possess traits that might have flourished under slightly altered conditions: heavier bodies, more specialized diets, or alternative reproductive strategies. In another sequence of events, forests might have echoed with forms unlike any living today, and open plains could have hosted mammal groups now known only through fragments. These possibilities existed briefly, then slipped away as conditions shifted. History narrowed through a process that favored persistence over potential. Environmental change rarely allowed space for prolonged experimentation. Habitats expanded and contracted unevenly, removing niches before lineages could adapt fully. Geographic isolation restricted movement, trapping populations where change arrived too quickly. Extinction did not select the most imaginative forms, but those that aligned best with ongoing instability. Evolution unfolded as a series of close calls rather than steady ascent. Lineages survived, not by surpassing others, but by enduring what followed. Each transition trimmed diversity, leaving behind forms that fit narrowly within the limits of the moment. What remained became the foundation for what followed, not because it was ideal, but because it persisted long enough to continue. Chance played a quiet role. Random survival of small populations influenced which traits carried forward. A group spared by geography or timing could expand later, while equally capable relatives vanished elsewhere. Over time, these small differences compounded, shaping entire ecosystems. The narrowing of outcomes was gradual, guided by accumulation rather than single turning points. The present reflects this compression of possibility. Mammals today share deep commonalities because alternatives were lost. Diversity exists within boundaries drawn long ago, boundaries defined by what survived repeated filtering. The absence of certain forms is not evidence of failure, but of paths never fully traveled. Imagining these unrealized worlds does not replace what exists, but enriches understanding. It reminds us that evolution is not a march toward perfection, but a passage through constraint. What appears stable rests on layers of contingency beneath. The earth that formed could have looked different without altering its rules. Mountains, rivers, and forests would still rise and fade, yet the animals moving through them might have followed other designs. Instead, the world settled into its current shape through survival that favored flexibility and restraint. This perspective brings quiet appreciation for what remains. Mammals carry within them the outcome of countless near endings, shaped by survival that was never guaranteed. The present world stands not as a culmination, but as a continuation, one expression among many that almost were, shaped by evolution moving carefully through a landscape of close calls. The mammals that vanished leave behind lessons shaped not by triumph, but by endurance set against uncertainty. Their histories reveal resilience, expressed quietly, through persistence rather than power. Many lineages survived dramatic environmental shifts, competition, and repeated losses, continuing for millions of years without ever becoming dominant. Their eventual disappearance does not erase that strength. It reframes it as something fragile, dependent on circumstance as much as adaptation. Resilience appears here not as invulnerability, but as the ability to continue despite narrow margins. These mammals endured unstable climates, shifting landscapes, and changing ecosystems by remaining flexible. Yet, the same qualities that allowed survival did not guarantee permanence. Small changes layered over time could overwhelm even well-adapted forms. The lesson is subtle. Endurance can coexist with vulnerability, and strength does not imply security. Extinction often unfolded without clear pattern. Some mammal groups disappeared during times of apparent stability, while others survived through harsher intervals. Random factors such as local climate swings, isolated droughts, volcanic disruptions, or geographic barriers played decisive roles. Survival could hinge on being in the right place at a quiet moment. Lineages with similar traits experienced different fates simply through timing and location. This randomness challenges the idea that extinction always reflects failure. Chance interacted constantly with biology. A population reduced briefly could recover, while another, equally capable, might collapse beyond return. Genetic diversity lost through bottlenecks limited future adaptation. Small, hidden events accumulated until recovery was no longer possible. Extinction rarely arrived as a single dramatic blow. It often emerged gradually, shaped by invisible pressures that aligned just long enough to close a path forward. These lost mammals also demonstrate survival without dominance. Many flourished within restricted ecological roles, never expanding widely, never reshaping environments at large scale. Their success was measured by continuity, not control. They coexisted alongside larger animals, occupying niches that required precision rather than power. Their disappearance does not negate that success. It highlights that dominance is not the primary currency of survival across deep time. This perspective reshapes how survival is understood. Persistence does not require expansion. Influence does not require visibility. Many mammals lived full evolutionary lives without leaving lasting descendants. Their impact existed within their own time, woven into ecosystems now gone. Judging survival only by modern representation overlooks this richness. The lessons extend beyond mammals. Life across Earth reflects the same balance between resilience and fragility. Species endure through alignment with their environment, yet remain subject to forces beyond control. Extinction emerges not solely from weakness, but from misalignment as conditions drift. In the end, these lost mammals teach humility. Survival is not a reward for superiority, nor extinction a verdict on worth. Life continues through narrow windows, shaped by chance, flexibility, and restraint. The mammals that disappeared remind us that existence itself is provisional, sustained not by dominance, but by quiet persistence through a world that never stops changing. Most life that has ever existed no longer walks, swims, or breathes beneath today's skies. Earth's history is shaped less by what remains than by what has passed. Layers of rock hold countless arrivals and departures, marking a rhythm of appearance, persistence, and disappearance that has repeated for hundreds of millions of years. Extinction is not an interruption in this story. It is its most common outcome. Mammals sit squarely within this pattern. Though familiar and abundant in the present, they represent only a narrow slice of what once existed. Lineages rose, adapted, and endured for vast spans of time before fading away. Their absence today does not diminish their role. It reveals how narrow the pathway from past to present truly is. Survival, when viewed across deep time, is rare rather than expected. This quiet majority of extinct life shaped the world as surely as the species that followed. Mammals that vanished influenced food webs, soil structure, seed dispersal, and predator-prey balance in their ecosystems. They interacted with plants, insects, and other animals now equally gone. Each disappearance altered these systems subtly, adjusting the flow of energy and opportunity for what remained. The present world stands on these accumulated changes. Recognizing this shifts perspective. Modern mammals are often treated as endpoints or successes, yet they are continuations shaped by loss. Traits that persist do so not only because they worked, but because alternatives were removed. Diversity today reflects repeated narrowing, not steady expansion. Remembering lost lineages restores depth to this understanding. There is also humility in this view. Extinction was not reserved for the weak or ill-suited. Many vanished after long periods of stability. Some thrived until circumstances shifted just beyond their tolerance. Others disappeared without obvious cause, erased by local changes magnified over time. Their stories remind us that endurance does not guarantee permanence. Remembering lost mammals matters because it reframes success. It encourages attention to persistence rather than dominance, to alignment rather than control. The mammals that remain did not outcompete every rival in clear contests. They passed through windows that stayed open just long enough. This understanding tempers narratives of progress and replaces them with continuity shaped by chance. There is also value in memory itself. Extinct lineages expand imagination, showing how many forms life can take. They reveal solutions evolution explored and then abandoned. By studying what is gone, science gains context for what exists. Patterns become clearer when viewed against absence rather than presence alone. Earth's history, when seen fully, is not a gallery of survivors, but a vast archive of lives completed. The quiet majority shaped landscapes, climates, and biological pathways that continue today. Mammals are part of that majority as much as they are part of the present. Holding this perspective invites a gentler relationship with deep time. It emphasizes connection rather than exception. The living are not separate from the lost, but composed of their influence. In remembering extinct mammals, the story of life becomes broader, richer, and more honest, grounded not only in what endured, but in everything that once was. The story of mammals, traced through loss and endurance, returns gently to the present. Modern mammals move through forests, oceans, cities, and open plains, carrying bodies shaped by deep time. Their forms feel familiar because they are close to us, yet they are also the result of countless disappearances that cleared narrow paths forward. What lives today exists because so much did not. Every mammal now breathing is connected to ancestors that survived when continuation was uncertain. Bones, instincts, senses, and behaviors carry quiet histories shaped by environments long vanished. Warmth maintained through cold nights, flexible diets that shift with season, and parental care extended through vulnerability all reflect solutions tested repeatedly against instability. These traits persist not because they guaranteed success, but because they allowed survival often enough. The connection to deep time is thin, yet unbroken. It passes through moments when populations fell to a few survivors, through climates that reshaped continents, through competition that narrowed possibility. That thread was never reinforced by certainty. It held because chance and condition aligned briefly. Then again, then again. Modern mammals stand at the far end of that thread, not above it. This perspective softens ideas of dominance. Mammals did not inherit the earth as a prize. They continued within it because alignment remained possible. Expansion followed only after restriction lifted, and even then it carried limits. The present abundance of mammals reflects opportunity shaped by earlier loss, not immunity from future change. Recognizing this does not diminish the present, it deepens it. Each animal represents persistence carried forward through moments when extinction stood close. The variety of mammals alive today reflects the few branches that remained after extensive pruning. Their diversity is real, yet it is bounded by what history allowed to persist. Existence, when viewed through this lens, becomes provisional rather than permanent. Environments change, climates drift, and systems reorganize. Life responds within those conditions, sometimes enduring, sometimes fading quietly. Survival is influenced by preparation, but never fully controlled by it. Chance threads through every outcome. This understanding invites care rather than alarm. It encourages attention to continuity rather than prediction. The mammals alive now, including humans, are participants in an ongoing process shaped by time more than intention. Awareness of fragility does not weaken this story, it grounds it. As the narrative settles, what remains is not a warning, but a gentle reminder. Life has always moved within uncertainty. Mammals persisted without certainty, adapting without guarantee. Their history is not a promise, but a record of continuation under conditions that were rarely stable. The thin thread connecting present mammals to deep time still stretches forward, shaped by forces beyond any single generation. It carries within it resilience and vulnerability together. Survival is never guaranteed, yet it continues quietly, moment by moment, shaped by chance, environment, and time.